Okay, so we are about to begin lecture number 113 of More Nevuchim, of Guide for the Perplexed. And again, I'm using the Shlomo Penis edition. We are about to start part 3, chapter 26, which is on page 506. So when I say page numbers, I'm referencing that edition. And the Rambam is about to begin his quest to explain the reasons for the mitzvot, why the Torah tells us to do what it tells us to do, and what the point of it all. So, if you remember in last chapter, he talked about God's actions always being for a reason, right? So, and he set up a difference between the people who say that God's actions are for a reason, in other words, there's a purpose to every single thing in the universe, versus some people that say that it's just because it's His will, right? And I wasn't clear last time on what's the difference between saying God does it for a reason and we don't know the reason, or God does it because that's what He wants, right? I wasn't clear, so I'm gonna be much more clear when he revisits that issue this time, and it will shed some light on what he means by those two different opinions and what's different about them and why they're fundamentally different. So, and the Rambam already has come down on the side that to say that it is a certain way because God wants it that way, because that's His will, and leave it at that is not acceptable, right? But rather, anything that happens is because it's important. It should be that way, right? And he applied that to every single part of existence, so that every animal, every creature, every plant, every molecule, for that matter, is around because that has a purpose and a point, and it's meaningful. So, we may not necessarily know the meaning of a particular creature, but that doesn't mean there isn't one. And there is one, and it's real, and it's important, and it's valuable in and of itself. And it's not just because, oh, God wanted it. That's not enough. Now, I know there's a little bit missing to that argument, but you'll hear the rest, and you'll understand it a little better as he applies the same argument to the mitzvot, to the commandments that God gave us in the Torah. So here we go, chapter 26. Excuse me. Just as there is a disagreement among the men of speculation, among the adherents of Torah, right? So in other words, Rambam is acknowledging that he is disagreeing here. He is about to disagree with adherents of the Torah, other Torah scholars who have a different take on this point, right? Whether his works, and they argue whether his works may he be exalted. In other words, the things that he does, the creatures that he created, the universe that he created, are consequent upon wisdom or upon the will alone, without being intended toward any end at all. There is the same disagreement among them regarding our laws, right? The mitzvot, which he has given to us. Thus, there are people who do not seek for them any cause at all, saying that all laws are consequent upon the will alone. In other words, we shouldn't be looking for a reason why God told us to do X, Y, Z. He told us to do X, Y, Z because that's what He wants. Finished. Enough. That's all, right? And I'm not going to think of some reason, right? Because there isn't. I don't have to. I don't have to come up with a reason. That's what God wanted us to do. There are also people who say that every commandment and prohibition in these laws is consequent upon wisdom and aims at some end, and that all laws have causes and were given in view of some utility. Every mitzvah has a reason. This is the second point of view, and there's a purpose to it, and there's a utility to it. It accomplishes something. It achieves something. Now, here's where I'm going to point something out that's very important, and it's going to become obvious in this chapter and in the chapters as we read what the Rambam is really arguing against here. So in the Rambam's scheme, when he says a reason and utility, he means something that human minds are capable of understanding and achieving. We may not yet have achieved that understanding, but we're capable. We can get there, right? In other words, so the Rambam would not accept what some would say is like give some kind of mystical explanation. This mitzvah is important because it achieves some kind of spiritual thing in a celestial sphere or something like that, right? Mystical reasons which are very common in Kabbalistic thinking, but not just in Kabbalistic thinking, but it's very common in other Jewish thinkers as well. That, according to Rambam, would be the same thing as saying it's the will alone, right? That's not acceptable, right? Now, the Rambam is about to say, I admit that there might be some mitzvot that I have some difficulty, or we may not quite yet understand them, right? However, it's inconceivable to the Rambam that it's impossible. If we were truly able to focus our minds and our hearts and study and work and learn and purify ourselves so that we negate from our minds and our hearts all extraneous thoughts and arrogance and selfish reasons for thinking of things, we can eventually achieve that wisdom, right? It may not be easy. Some places are obvious and less obvious, and he's going to develop this idea, and you'll see as he develops it. So it is, however, the doctrine of all of us, both of the multitude and of the elite, right? In other words, everyone, and even the elite, like the intellectuals, that all the laws have a cause, though we ignore the causes for some of them, and we do not know the manner in which they conform to wisdom. In other words, some of them we do despite not knowing the reason, right? Because we don't know exactly what they will achieve and what the purpose is, but there is one, right? With regard to this, the texts of the book are clear. Righteous statutes, are chukim umishpatim, right? And the verse of was of I'm sorry, I'm reading Mishpatei Hashem emes tzaduki yachtav, right? Is the verse, right? The judgments of the Lord are true and they are righteous altogether. In other words, they have a reason. So it's interesting because think about it. What the Rambam is saying here is that when it says the judgments of the Lord are true, right? Mishpatei Hashem emes, in the Rambam's mind, that means they're true and we can achieve that truth, right? They're things that actually make sense to us, right? Because someone else could look at this pasuk and say, yes, the Mishpatei Hashem, the laws of God are true, but they do some kind of spiritual thing that we'll never be able to understand. And then which in Rambam's scheme, that's exactly tantamount to saying that's the will of God alone. So the Rambam is using this verse to support his own theory, but others would use the same verse to support theirs, right? The Rambam says, Mishpatei Hashem emes means the judgments of the Lord are true, because and righteous, true and righteous in the Rambam's mind means understandable and sensible and logical. And that's the point that I'm trying to make here. And if you keep that in mind, now it draws a light. Now you can understand a little bit better what we learned last week, right? Because every single creature, every single being, every part of the universe has a reason, has a purpose, and it's important in and of itself. You may not see its importance right away. If you try to imagine, you go to a new ecosystem or something. You travel to a tropical island and you see this little bug and it's running around and it's just a tiny little bug and you don't and whatever, you don't care about it and you squash the bug, right? Because and the bug starts to annoy you, so you find a pesticide and you kill that whole bug out of the island because who cares, just a little bug, right? And then all of a sudden, and nowadays you realize, no, that bug was food for this fly, and this fly is food for this turtle, and this turtle is food for, and so on and so forth, and you just wreck the entire ecosystem because of a tiny little bug. I'm just using that as a way to compare that. So we look around the world and we think, and now more and more and more, the more we learn, the more we see how true what the Rambam is saying is, in ways that he couldn't have possibly have conceived of 1,000 years ago, right? And that is that every single thing has an incredible amount of importance, no matter how small or insignificant it may seem to us on the surface. There's a real reason that if we did enough work, we can figure out why it's important. So about the statutes designated as chukim, I'm starting the second paragraph on page 507 now. For instance, those concerning we know that it's famous, but I'll say this now, that chukim umishpatim are typically divided as chukim, a chok, meaning a mitzvah, a commandment which we don't the reason is not readily understandable, and a mishpat is just, it makes sense, and the classic examples, you shouldn't steal, right? That's a mishpat. It makes sense. There aren't too many people around who says, I don't understand why we're not allowed to steal, right? So I mean, maybe there's some, but not too many, right? Most people realize that that's understandable, right? But then when I tell you you're not allowed to you're not allowed to eat a cheeseburger because it's meat and milk, what's the point? I can eat cheese, I can eat meat, so why can't I eat a cheeseburger, right? So that doesn't make sense. So the Rambam says, so as for the statutes that are designated as chukim, for instance, and the examples he gives are the mingled stuff, that's shatnes, right? The mixing wool and linen in clothing, right? Meat and milk, right? The example I gave, and the sending of the goat, that's the Sa'ir HaMishtaleach on Yom Kippur, where a goat is sent out into the wilderness and thrown off a cliff. Like, what's the point of these things, right? So may the sages, may their memory be blessed, made literally the following statement, right? And in the Hebrew is Devarim shechakakti lecha ve'ein lecha reshus laharher b'hen, right? These are things which I have given to you as laws, and you do not have permission to think badly about them. V'hasatan mekatreg aleihen, and the Satan, or the Satan, kind of uses it to poke fun, right? The umos olam meshivan aleim, and the Gentiles look at it and they say, this is silly stuff, right? What's the point? Why in the world would I not be allowed to eat meat and milk? It makes no sense. So people make fun of it, they poke fun of it, and the Chachamim tell us not to do that. They are not believed by but don't think that the Chazal, that the sages are saying, this is what the Rambam is saying, don't think they're saying that there is no reason. There is a reason, right? But they're not believed by the multitude of sages to be things for which there is no cause at all, and for which one must not seek an end. They're not saying don't try to figure out why. They're not saying there is no reason why. For this would lead, according to what we have explained, to their being considered as futile actions. If there truly was no reason, then they would fall into the category of actions we mentioned last week that are futile, purposeless, right? You send this goat off a cliff for what? For nothing. Just what? No purpose of it, right? You're just doing something and it's a waste. On the contrary, the multitude of the sages, the Chazal, in other words, our rabbis, believe that there indubitably is a cause for them. I mean to say a useful end, but that it is hidden from us, either because of the incapacity of our intellects or the deficiency of our knowledge. So this is the key thing. Remember, according to the Rambam, the lack of the fact that we don't know the reason is because we haven't figured it out yet, right? We don't know enough, right? And or our intellect is just not smart enough, right? But if we could be, it's achievable, and we should try to find it, right? Consequently, there is, in their opinion, a cause for all the commandments. I mean to say that any particular commandment or prohibition has a useful end. And remember, in the Rambam's mind, useful end means an end which you and I, as a human being, at least theoretically, can understand, right? It doesn't mean a useful end because of some spiritual concept that we cannot conceive of or see. In the case of some of them, it is clear to us in what way they are useful, right? As is the prohibition of killing and stealing. This is a similar example to the one that I just gave. In the case of others, their utility is not clear, as in the case of the interdiction of the first products of trees. That's Arla. That's the law that you're not allowed to eat the fruit from the tree the first 3 years of its life, right? So on the surface of it, I mean, what's the difference? I have an apple tree. It grew apples. What is it going to be with the apples? They're just going to fall. So I might as well eat them, right? Why shouldn't I eat them the first 3 years? It doesn't make sense, right? So it doesn't seem to make sense, right? Or sowing the vineyard with diverse seeds. Why can't I plant one plant next to another plant if they're different species? These commandments, those commandments whose utility is clear to the multitude, are called mishpatim. The commandments that everybody understands. You don't have to be an intellectual genius to understand. Those are mishpatim, right? Those whose utility is not clear to the multitude are called chukim. The ones that aren't clear to everyone, that when you first, on the surface, they look foolish or at least purposeless, right? Those are the statutes. Those are the chukim. They always say, they, meaning Chazal, always say, with regard to the verse, there is no vain thing. And if it is vain, it is because of you, right? Meaning that this legislation is not a vain matter without a useful end. and that if it seems to you that this is the case with regard to some of the commandments, the deficiency resides in your apprehension, right? You haven't yet figured it out. You already know the tradition that is widespread among us, according to which the causes for all the commandments, with the exception of that concerning the red heifer, right, were known to Solomon. That's a famous Medrash, is famous Chazal, that Shlomo HaMelech was so wise that he figured out all the reasons for all the mitzvot, except he couldn't figure out the reason for the red heifer, right? What exactly is the point of that mitzvah? And also their dictum that God hid the causes for the commandments in order that they should not be held in little esteem, as happened to Shlomo with regard to the three commandments whose causes are made clear. I'm going to read you a little bit of that story of Shlomo, because he doesn't say it here. And I'm reading actually from the notes of the Goodman Lieberman translation, but this is from their notes. So the reason why I'm reading it is because it's classic, and any discussion of Tamei HaMitzvot requires one to be familiar with the story of Shlomo, to the extent that the Rambam assumes that you know it here, and he just says, "Yeah, we know this, but in case you don't or you just need a refresher, let me teach it to you now." Okay, so the story goes as follows. And it's actually something those of us that are studying Daf Yomi have just studied maybe a week or two ago in Sanhedrin. So the story of Shlomo is meant to explain why the reasons. I'm reading from their own notes. This is their rendition of that story, which is from Sanhedrin. Is meant to explain why the reasons for the laws are not generally stated. Rabbi Yitzchak reasoned as follows: why were the reasons for biblical laws not disclosed? And he answers, because in 2 verses, the reasons were revealed, and that led the world's finest man to stumble. Because it is written, he shall not take many wives, referring to the king of Israel, right? Lest his heart be led astray. So Solomon said, right, I will marry many, but not let my heart be led astray, right? I'll do this mitzvah. If the Torah says the reason why I shouldn't marry too many wives is because they're going to lead me astray, so I know myself. I'll be fine. I'll marry as many as I want because the Torah said the reason, right? Yet we read that in his old age, Solomon's wives turned his heart towards other gods, and he was no longer wholehearted with the Lord as his father David had been. This is unfortunately what happened at the end of Shlomo's career. His heart was led astray, right? But Shlomo said, so then the Torah says, he shall not have many horses and return the people to Egypt to get more, right? So Shlomo said, I shall have many, but not return the people to Egypt. Yet we read, a chariot from Egypt went for, so on and so forth. It talks about how Shlomo went to Egypt to deal with horses, and that he ended up going down that direction, suggesting that the Israelites were impoverished, even enslaved, as a result of the inflation fueled by Solomon's excessive demand for chariot teams. So the bottom line is, so despite his wisdom, Shlomo became an object lesson against presuming to meet the law's ends without scrupulously keeping the rules that are its means. So this rabbinic concern, and these are the words of the writers of the note now. So that's the story from Sanhedrin. So think for a minute what we learned from this and what the Rambam is going to do with this. So the rabbinic concern anchors a traditionalist bias against seeking Tamei HaMitzvot, grounds for the commandments, lest it breed reductionist dismissals of observance. So this then is the traditionalist, in other words, the non-Maimonideans, who will say that the reason why the Torah doesn't keep mitzvot, and we shouldn't even look for Tamei HaMitzvot, because anytime we try to explain the logical reason for a mitzvah, we're giving people an out. We're going to say, you're supposed to keep this mitzvah because of X, Y, Z, and someone will say, well, I don't need to worry about X, Y, Z, so I don't need to keep the mitzvah, right? Someone will say, the reason for Shabbat, say, is, people need to have a day of rest. So a guy will say, all right, so I don't need rest. I can work hard. I'm fine. Or someone will say, so I don't need to keep Shabbat. Or, I need rest, but for me, it's easier on Tuesday. So I'm keeping it on Tuesday. Or what, you can understand this, what lesson they are learning from this story. In the Sefer HaMitzvot, capping the final negative mitzvot in his listing, the Rambam says, when he talks about against the mitzvot of royal polygamous excess and extravagance with horses and amassing of wealth, the Rambam retells the story. He tells the story there of Shlomo, which we just said, And he agrees that the Torah usually leaves the reasons for the mitzvot unstated to avoid such logic chopping, right? For even a mind like Shlomo's was not immune to self-deception. See, what was it that led Shlomo astray? It was the self-deception of his mind. It was the arrogance. Remember, the Rambam told us numerous times that in order to come to truth, we have to eliminate arrogance, right? From our and self and our own selfish desires from our quest for the truth. Because if our quest for the truth is informed by what we want to see, and by our desires, then we're not going to reach the truth, right? So, but having made that point, Rambam then continues and forthrightly rejects the legal positivism often erected on its basis. He doesn't conclude what the traditionalists conclude. By citing the pasuk, a verse in Psalms, he affirms that there is not one commandment without a reason, a grounding immediate or remote, although the masses may not see it. Knowing these grounds, we can say, enables one to understand the laws, explain them, and even codify them, as Maimonides did with deep sensitivity to the Torah's large, often tacit themes. Rational development of its moral and spiritual themes is the sage's crucial vehicle in the law's elaboration. For one cannot make a hedge about the law without knowing its aims, right? The Rambam says if you're going to make laws, the rabbis part of the function of the rabbis is to enact decrees or guide us so that we keep the mitzvot properly and don't transgress the commandments that we're not supposed to do, right? And if they don't understand the purpose of the mitzvah in the first place, how can they make laws that make sense, right? By probing its themes, halacha can be cultivated to grow organically, holding true to its purposes, right? It is the sage's historic achievement in critical, receptive, and creative appropriation of the Torah's themes that leads Rambam to call them prophets. That's going a little bit off. So the point is that even though the Rambam admits and understands that the Torah conceals the reasons from the masses, right? Because people who allow their minds to be deceived, right, will be deceived and then may not keep the Torah properly. On the other hand, the Rambam says that doesn't mean there is no reason, and that doesn't mean that we shouldn't try to seek the reason and understand the reason, because by seeking and understanding the reason, we can live our lives in a better way, and we can guide others if we're in the position to do so. If we're in a position of leadership, we can guide others in such ways so that they can properly keep them. A lot of things when we need guidance, whether we seek guidance from our own hearts or from people that we trust or from the books that we read and teachings and so on, right? It's not necessarily guidance that you're asking, whether or not I should keep Shabbat, for example, or whatever the mitzvah is. But it's guidance. What is it appropriate for me to do X, Y, Z, on Friday afternoon, but 10 minutes before Shabbat? And if you think and you start thinking about it yourself, you realize, well, what's the purpose and point? Is what I'm doing now going to take away from Shabbat, right? And a lot of times you realize that on your own. But you could only get that because you understand and feel the reason for Shabbat to be a mitzvah, right? So then you can make appropriate guardrails for yourself. And you can make appropriate practices. You can do certain things that enhance the spirit of Shabbat, because you understand the reason for it. But if you completely ignore the reason, then you can't do that, right? And that's the Rambam's point that he's making here. And now, so I'm about to start on 508, the second paragraph, starting all their dicta proceed according to this principle. Everything that Chazal says goes according to this same idea, and the texts of the books indicate it. However, I found in Bereshit Rabbah, right, I found a text of the sages, may their memory be blessed, from which it appears when one first reflects on it, that some of the commandments have no other cause than merely to prescribe a law without there having been in view in them any other end or any real utility, right? So this is I'm going to read it in Hebrew. And it says like this. What did they say? What does God care? If somebody slaughters an animal on its neck, for one who slaughters it from the back, in other words, basically by chopping off its head, right? Havi Omer, Therefore, God doesn't care, right? So what does it matter to God? You kill the animal and eat it, right? So Havi Omer lo nitnu mitzvot el litzrot bahen et habrios. The giving of the mitzvahs was only to purify the people. Shenemar imar Hashem trufa. God's words purify us. Now, it might make on the surface, and indeed many commentaries understand it this way. What it seems to be teaching is that there is no real reason for it. God just gives us mitzvot, and there are many commentaries who explain it this way, because he wants us to do things so that we live the way he lives. He gives us rules so that we should go through the motions of doing what God wants, but not because there's anything inherently valuable in it. Imagine if someone who thinks, and the Rambam clearly believes, if someone who thinks that God tells me I should put tefillin on this arm, wrap it like this, not because there's any significance to tying it near your heart and the figurative, the value and the meaning behind it and what it's supposed to affect, how it's supposed to change you, but simply because God decided that we should wrap 7 times and tie here and tie there, and because he wanted us to do stuff, right? Because he wants to make commands that we keep, and that's how someone can understand this. And the Rambam would say, if you're telling me that you do it because if you fly from the level A world, Sphirot, and all kinds of Kabbalistic notions, the Rambam would say the same thing, that doesn't make logical sense. That's not reasonable. That's like saying it's the will alone. It has to have a real reason. There has to be a purpose and a point. So though this dictum is very strange and no parallel in their other dicta, I have interpreted it, as you will hear, in such a manner. So you might think that this contradicts me, Rambam is saying, right? You see that it's not true. God only commanded just because he wants us to do what he says, right? But no, I have interpreted, and we'll see very soon together how the Rambam interprets this. And so that, no, in such a manner that, no, that's not what it means at all. And all the other proofs that I brought until now that show that there is a reason, a logical, real reason for every mitzvah, applies even to this particular saying, and he'll explain what it means. And we shall not disagree with the universally agreed upon principle, namely that one should seek in all the laws an end that is useful with regard to being. In other words, we should seek a reason. We shouldn't just say, that God did it because that's the way he wanted us to do it. For it is no vain thing. He says, I said unto the seed of Jacob, seek me, ye me for nothing. I, the Lord, speak righteousness. I declare things that are right. Remember, according to Rambam, right means it makes sense, right? Truth means something that's intellectually, logically sound and reasonable. That's what truth means according to Rambam. So now, what everyone endowed with a sound intellect ought to believe on this subject is what I shall set forth to you. So now he's going to lay down something important. So and he's going to say it in more detail, but I'm going to give you a preview of what he's going to say, so that you pick it up properly. And that is the idea that every mitzvah, every commandment, right? There's the basic commandment, right? You must. I kept using Shabbat as an example, so you have to keep Shabbat. But then there's tons and tons of details, right? You have to do it this time and not that time, and this way and not that way, and you have to do it to the right, to the left, up, down. There's all things in it. Now, many times in a lot of the details, there could be logical reasons that we can understand, but sometimes the details seem to be superfluous. They seem to be, like, what's the point, right? So the Rambam is going to tell us now that he's only going to bother telling us and explaining to us and using his time and effort to teach us the reasons for the mitzvah itself, the general mitzvah. Why do we do X? Why don't we do Y? Right? That's it. The details, don't waste your time trying to figure out all the details. He doesn't necessarily mean that there's never any reason for some of the details, but it's not worth wasting your time, because sometimes you might ask, well, if the example that he gives later is the mitzvah of karbonot, of sacrifices. So why this carbon is a lamb and this one is a ram? Like, but if there was a ram, then he would ask, why is it a ram and not a lamb? So So he's going to say this in a minute. I'm really paraphrasing the Rambam himself. But the point being that and now I'm reading his words, and still in the third paragraph on page 508. The generalities of the commandments necessarily have a cause and have been given because of a certain utility. The general reason for each mitzvah, right, has a reason, and that's and it has a purpose. Their details are that in regard to which was said of the commandments, that they were given merely for the sake of commanding something, right? The details, right, when they said, they just needed to, just for the sake of commanding something, there had to be a way to do it. So these are the guidelines. So the details don't necessarily always have a reason that's going to make us give some profound truth to them. Often the details are just details because there has to be details. So these are the details. For instance, the killing of animals because of the necessity of having good food. Here's an interesting example, Jeffrey, so here in the Penis edition, it's good food, and in the new translation, the English, it's good nutrition, right? So which is a different meaning to it. Even so, you see how like one little word in English. Which one is more accurate to the original Arabic? I don't know because I don't read Judeo-Arabic, but regardless, we need killing of animals is necessary for nutrition. We need to eat meat. Is manifestly useful, as we shall make clear. But the prescription that they should be killed through having the upper and not lower part of their throat cut, certain things, which exact part of the throat it's supposed to be, right? Having their esophagus and windpipe severed at one particular place, like other prescriptions of the same kind, imposed with the view to purifying the people, right? So some of those things are kind of just details, right? The same thing is made clear to you through their example, slaughtered by cutting their neck in front or in the back. I have made this example to you merely because one finds in their text, slaughtered by cutting their neck in front or in the back. However, if one studies the truth of the matter, one finds it as follows. As necessity occasions the eating of animals, the commandment itself, right, the point, what's the purpose of the mitzvah of shechita, right, was intended to bring about the easiest death in an easy manner, right? So for beheading would only be possible with the help of a sword or something similar. Again, the other translation says the easiest death, I forget the exact words, that it doesn't mean in an easy, meaning in an easy manner to the animal, right? In a way that's not just easy for the person to do, but it's also easy for the animal. It's the less the less painful, the less traumatic for the animal. Beheading would be possible. You'd need a sword or something similar, or an axe or something, right? Whereas a throat can be cut with anything. In order that death should come about more easily, and here in the new translation, it's specifically that the animal's death should be more easy on the animal, the condition was imposed that the knife should be sharp. So the bottom line is like this, and let me summarize, because I'm cheated a little because I was using several other translations, and the meaning of this translation isn't so clear. The bottom line is that what the Rambam is really saying is when they said, what does it matter to the Holy One that animals are slaughtered this way or that way? It does matter a lot, right? Because the reason why God said to do it this way is so that it should be easy, both easy and quick for the person, which subsequently is also easy and quick on the animal, right? It was necessary that we eat it, so we have to slaughter it somehow. So L'tzarif ben Sabrios means, right, the mitzvah was given in such a way in order that people should be better. People should be purified by slaughtering it in an easier way. Not L'tzarif ben Sabrios that we should do meaningless things, but L'tzarif ben Sabrios because there is meaning. So he just took that phrase and flipped it upside down. Instead of meaning that the commandments are meaningless, that now it means the exact opposite. Right? God did it that way because it's meaningful, because by doing it this way, we become better people, right? Because we kill the animal in a less traumatic and less painful way. But however, like the specific details, like exactly how this has to be done like this, right? In this spot and not that spot, that's a detail that you can sit and she's very upset with me. I'm sorry, my cat. But that's a detail which you're going to have to, you don't bother trying to figure out. And he's going to use an example. The offering of sacrifices has in itself a great and manifest utility, as I shall make clear. Later on down the road, which we actually looked at way back in the beginning of this class a couple of years ago. I kind of jumped ahead to the Rambam's treatment of sacrifices, but we'll get to it later, when we get there, chapter 46. So what is that? Probably like 5 months away, 4 months away. So there is a purpose to sacrifices. What that is, worry about it later, right? But no cause will ever be found for the fact that one particular sacrifice consists in a lamb and the other in a ram, and that the number of victims should be one particular number. In other words, that you have to slaughter 5 animals or 7 animals or 2 animals, right? Accordingly, in my opinion, all those who occupy themselves with finding causes for something of these particulars are stricken with a prolonged madness in the course of which they do not put an end to an incongruity, but rather increase the number of incongruities. They're wasting time trying to figure this out. So in other words, what he's saying really is that don't bother wasting your time trying to figure out all the details. He doesn't say there is no reason for the details, right? There may actually be reasons, and sometimes those reasons could be obvious, right? But don't waste your time. Focus on the main deal. Focus on the reason for the mitzvah itself. Those who imagine that a cause may be found for such like things are as far from truth as those who imagine that the generalities of a commandment are not designed with a view to some real utility, right? Are just like they're just as bad off if you're going to sit and waste your time to try to come up with an exact reason for every little tiny thing that in halacha. Then you're going to end up going, it's almost as bad as thinking that there is no real reason for a mitzvah, because some of the reasons you're going to come up with are going to be crazy reasons. So no, I'm about to start the second paragraph on 509. Know that wisdom rendered it necessary, or if you will, say that necessity occasioned, that there should be particulars for which no cause can be found. It was, as it were, impossible in regard to the Torah that there should be nothing of this class in it. Let me try to figure out what, give me 1 second to think. I'm sorry. Because this sentence just twisted my brain. And he's saying it had to be this way, that there's going to be some particulars which you'll never be able to figure out the reason for. In such a case, why is this impossible? The impossibility is due to the circumstances that when you ask why a lamb should be prescribed and not a ram, the same question would have to be asked if a ram had been prescribed instead of a lamb, right? But one particular species necessarily had to be chosen. So God chose one of them, and you're going to drive yourself bonkers. The same holds for your asking why 7 lambs and not 8 have been prescribed. For a similar question would have been put if 8 or 10 or 20 had been prescribed. Remember, the sentence at the end of the last paragraph, the Rambam compared those who try to find reasons for this to those who think there is no reason. Now, who's he arguing with when he says people say there is no reason? He's arguing with the mystics, right? Who give spiritual reasons for things, not real, tangible, understandable, intellectual reasons, right? And think about it for a minute. When was the last time you heard explanations for why there's 7 instead of 11 or 12 or 13, right? If you all should read the book by it's called Maimonides' Confrontation with Mysticism, right? I'll tell you the name of the author in a minute. But he describes there how the Rambam in this part, yeah, that's the book right there. You got it. Did you read it? Wait, you have to unmute yourself. It's Menachem Kellner. I don't know how that name slipped my mind because I quoted him a million times already. But anyway, all the reasons for 8 and 10 and 20. When was the last time you heard reasons being said by a rabbi and shul about them? Were they almost always mystical reasons? Because 7 corresponds to this and 8 corresponds to that. Those are all good. I'm not here to belittle them. They're good for that school of thought, for that. But that's the opposite of what the Rambam is trying to accomplish, right? He doesn't go for all that numerological stuff and all that stuff, right? He wants intellectual, actual reasons that make philosophical sense, right? So according to the Rambam, So the similar question would have been if 8 or 10 or 20 had been prescribed. However, one particular number hadn't necessarily chosen. There had to be an amount. So the Torah says an amount. Don't waste your time trying to figure out why, because if you do, you're going to end up in La La Land. And that's not the Maimonidean world. La La Land is okay for the mystics, but it's not okay for Maimonides, right? So this resembles the nature of the possible, for it is certain that one of the possibilities will come to pass. Something had to happen, and this is what happened. God had to command something. This is what he said. And no question should be put why one particular possibility and not another comes to pass. For a similar question wouldn't come necessary if another possibility instead of this particular one. In other words, you can ask, why did the lottery numbers end up being 165 and not 142? I don't know. It had to be something. So it landed on 165. No one's ever going to explain to you why. I guess in theory you could come up with, if it's dice, that the speed of this and the wind and the weight and come up with the reason. But the bottom line is we all know there is no real reason. You can waste your lifetime trying to figure out the reason, and you're never really going to. So the best reason you can come up with is because it was my lucky day, right? Some nonsensical, non-philosophically viable explanation. And that's, the Rambam says, if you're going to do the same thing with the mitzvot and try to get every single particular reason for it, you're going to end up with something nonsensical just like that. Know this notion and grasp it. Remember this. So again, focus on the main deal, right? The constant statements of the Chazal to the effect that there are causes for all the commandments, as well as the opinion that the causes were known to Shlomo. The Rambam says, although it's true, right, that Shlomo was the one who we criticized, right, who the Tanakh criticizes for having, and Chazal criticized, but he also knew the reason for everything. That means there's a reason that is achievable for a human being. But now, we may not all get there. Most of us don't have the mind of Shlomo, and most of us won't get to the point where we understand it all. But know that keep looking, and you'll be able to achieve the reasons for a lot of these things. Have in view the utility of a given commandment in a general way, not an examination of its particulars. This being so, now that I laid this down, right? So just to recap really quick, bottom line, every mitzvah has a reason, and it's a logical reason. It's a reason with utility. Even the statements in Chazal, which seem to indicate otherwise, the Rambam explained to us, right? And we're not, don't bother wasting your time trying to figure out the nitty gritty of the reason for every particular, but spend your time trying to figure out the reason for the general commandment, and then you'll understand it, and you'll be able to live a life and fulfill the purpose that the Torah has for you. And that's what we're going to do. In the next, 20, 30 chapters, he's going to go through reasons, and he's going to show you how to do it. But before he does that, of course, as the Rambam usually does, he has to lay out some rules. So this being so, I have seen to fit to divide the 613 commandments into a number of classes. I'm going to categorize the mitzvot into certain types, right? Every one of which comprises a number of commandments belonging to one kind or akin in meaning, like lump together a bunch of stuff. Just for example, mitzvot that are charitable. So that, the mitzvah to leave a corner of your field, to leave the droppings out there for the poor, all those things. That's like a category, right? They're different mitzvot, but we understand them in the same light, right? I shall inform you, and I just turned the page to the top of 510, of the cause of every one of these classes. So I'm going to tell you the general cause for all those classes, right? And I shall show their utility, about which there can be no doubt, to which there can be no objection. I'll explain it to you clearly. Now, it's interesting because that's the Rambam saying that in his own time. Some of the utility is based on his understanding of science and health of his day. And you will see that as we go through it. There are examples where the Rambam explains a mitzvah that doesn't really make sense anymore. Remember, he's saying this philosophically, not, but we'll get to that, and we'll deal with those problems when we reach them, because he's making a bold statement when he says there can be no doubt. But based on where the Rambam stood and the knowledge that he knew in his day, there can be no doubt about what he's going to try. What he's really trying to say is it's going to make a lot of sense, and you'll get it, right? I'm not going to give you some obscure, weird stuff, right? You'll understand it. You'll say, "Oh, okay, now I got it." And that's what Rambam is trying to drive us at, right? They drive us to, is that goal. Then I shall return to each of the commandments comprised in the class in question. So once I give the general reasons for the class of mitzvot, I'm going to talk about each one of the mitzvot within that class. I'll explain to you the cause of that one, so that only a very few commandments will remain whose cause has not been clear to me up to now. There's very few that I won't understand and I won't be able to explain to you, right? So the Rambam is admitting his own inadequacy, that he didn't quite reach the level of Shlomo HaMelech, but close, but not no cigar, right? So some of the particulars of conditions for and some of the commandments of wasn't clear to me. So remember, he's not saying that you can never find the reasons for the particulars of the mitzvot. You can sometimes, right? Like he gave an example, the sharpness of the knife to make it an easier death on the animal when it's being slaughtered. But so some of the particulars do have reasons, but he's just warned us against wasting too much time trying to come up with them. And it is possible to give their causes. You will hear all this. However, I shall not be able to clarify to you all this giving of causes before I set before you as a preliminary a number of chapters in which I will include premises that are useful as an introduction for the purpose I have in mind. So the next thing, these are the chapters which I will begin now, which you will begin with our next lecture, where the Rambam is going to lay out the basic premises that are important to understand before he starts explaining to us and going through the categories of mitzvot and what the reasons are. So obviously there's no time to start the next chapter, so we'll do 27 next time. I do want to tell you that this next week I won't give a class because I'm going to be on a military mission. I'll be overseas. So the next class that we have will be, let's see, I guess the 5th of February, it looks like, I guess. So it won't be next week. So I'll tell you that now. I'll send it out to the various text groups that we have for this class, but to remind you, but just FYI. All right, and now we can open the floor to questions, comments, issues, explanations, etc.
Yeah, so when he talks about explaining these mitzvot, I know you said he's going to put it into different categories. My question is, can you outline the categories of explanations that he's going to do? For instance, is it going to be based on science and logic? Is it going to be based on philosophy? What are the things that he is basing his explanations on? Is there a pattern in that, or is it going to be helter-skelter?
Well, all of his explanations are going to be, well, a combination of all of the above. But as he lays out his rules, he's going to answer that question, right? The rules he's going to lay out. So, for example, in chapter 27, he's going to what we're going to learn next together. It's going to be the rule that there's two general categories of purpose to the Torah. There's to keep us healthy as human beings, right, and society healthy, and to keep us, in others physically and spiritually. So those are two categories, and then he's gonna lay out other things like that. So in the end, so the categories are going to be based on a whole lot of stuff, but they're all going to be philosophically reasonable. So it's either going to be a spiritual reason, to lead us towards a certain belief or idea or practice, or a physical idea that's going to lead us to be better people, or a societal idea that's going to lead society to be a better society. But ultimately, all the mitzvot, every single one, ultimately is going to bring about a situation where people can achieve the highest spiritual level possible, right? Which is, in the Rambam's telling, a perfect intellect, an intellect that has achieved truth, MS. So everything is going to ultimately lead to that goal.
I see. So he's basically going to have some explanations that are philosophical or scientific or other,
Yeah.
but ultimately it all leads to what is the final goal of these mitzvot are, and that is to be a better spiritual being.
Being exactly 100%. Yes, and that's where everything is going to ultimately lead to that objective.
So it doesn't have to be a mystical sort of thing or whatever. It's just going to be based on the facts of these are the facts, and this is the way it goes, and this is why it goes that way, and this leads us to this part of our spiritual being, or this part of our health, or this part of whatever. Is that basically what we're going to where we're going?
It's exactly where it's going to go. exactly.
Okay. Yeah, because that makes me feel a little more comfortable with where we're headed
Yeah.
by understanding that up front. Yeah.
Yeah.
Thank you for that.
Oh, no problem. Yes.
Question,
Okay. Go ahead.
a quick question, so I can go to sleep tonight. Does he solve Solomon's quandary? Are we going to find out the reason for the red heifer, or do I have to just wait for that?
Sort of.
Sort of. Okay, sort of. So I
Yeah.
won't sleep as soundly, but I'll go to sleep.
Right. Sort of. Not really.
Okay.
There's a lot of the mitzvot you're going to say, oh, that makes a lot of sense. And many of them you probably heard. I mean, if you've been to enough sermons, you probably picked up something about it, and it was somewhere in the back of your brain. Oh, I remember the rabbi once said the Rambam explains this way or something. So it won't be completely new to most of us here, but there are some of them. Oh, interesting, and some of them will say that doesn't make sense based on our own understanding of modern science, especially sociological science. The way we understand people. You say, oh, that doesn't really jive with what my psychologist or my therapist told me last week. So, but we'll get there. We'll deal with those things, as we come to them. I think there was another hand. Was there?
I was just going to say that to Jeff and to everybody that even Solomon said that he doesn't know the red heifer. So who are
Right,
we
right.
to even try to guess what it is?
Yeah. Yeah, exactly. That's the one that Solomon didn't know. So, but the Rambam he wouldn't tell you not to try to think about it, right? Remember, he said, you know, although the chances of achieving understanding of that mitzvah requires a significant amount of it would be a huge intellectual achievement for somebody to figure it out. But he absolutely insists that there is an intellectually reasonable and understandable explanation for even that seemingly bizarre mitzvah, right? And that's what he insists. So we'll see whether, I mean, it'll take us several months, but when we finish his discussion of Tamei HaMitzvot, after that, there's just a little bit left to the entire book. This is really the last major subject that he tackles is Tamei HaMitzvot. After that, you'll look back and see if you agree with his approach. Some people looked at his approach and said, you know what? I'd rather go with the mystics approach, and plenty of people stick with that approach, and they like the other stuff. They like explaining things in mystical ways, and because it doesn't work for them. And I don't mean to demean that. We're just not teaching that approach right now, or we're teaching the Rambam's approach. I know
Yeah,
that. Yeah, go
yeah,
ahead.
I think there's a little bit for everybody. I mean, there's some people whose personalities and the way they are
Hmm.
tend to be more mystical and tend to be more into that arena,
Right.
and their brains are just not scientifically geared. They're geared in another way, or they may be, but that's not where they head with this.
Yeah.
And there are other people that, they're sort of stuck in facts and in science and understanding in that manner. I guess
Yeah.
it's a matter of how you understand it. I mean, different strokes for different folks, I guess, is the best way to say that. So,
Yep. And so, but right now we're studying the Rambam, so we'll see.
yeah.
And
And
if
a
it,
lot of people, well, the other thought I had was a lot of people take a little from each. It's not like it's all or none.
that's true. That's
Yeah.
absolutely true. Yeah.
Yeah, it's not all or none.
All right. Anyone else want to add something before we close up for the night? If not, then have a wonderful evening. Thank you so much for joining, and looking forward to not next week, but the week after next. Mir Hashem.
Thanks,
Thank
Saul. That
you.
was
Stay
a
safe.
Thank you,
nice
Saul.
discussion,
Safe
Saul.
travel.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Be
Bye.
safe.
Yeah.
Thanks.